For me, summer typically is a slower time of the year. I'm not working quite as much as I do during the school year. And I've been looking forward to this summer in particular, trying to draw back. But as I was reminded just before this service, it's hard to get away from the press of the world, from the news cycle and those things around. But I hope that you will find a little more laid back time in your summer for rest and reflection. Although that certainly wasn't in the lectionary readings this morning. Instead of just one gospel story, we were given 3 short, dramatic, and punchy pieces layered on top of each other and connected to this huge story of Abraham's calling in the Old Testament. And that, I think, highlights and sets this tone for what does it mean to be called? And what is this life of faith? Faith, that is a question that hangs in the air. So there's no resting on our laurels this morning. Something peculiar, even divinely mischievous is happening in Matthew's call, in that story. And while Matthew's call mirrors Abraham, Jesus is also up to something here. Maybe Matthew's call is the best call story of all of the disciples in the gospel. At least as I was listening to a podcast, one of my favorite hosts, Matthew Skinner, made that bold claim for his namesake, Matthew. So imagine it this way with me and with Matthew Skinner. Matthew's call is the best because Matthew is just minding his own business, doing his job, oppressing his neighbors. And Jesus comes up to him and says, "Follow me." And he follows. There's not a lot of fuss. There's no conversation for Matthew. He just does what he's told, and then the next thing that Matthew does in the story is throws a party. And he invites all of his tax collectors and sinners' friends to come and meet Jesus. Now, Abraham and Sarah get out of town and leave, but Matthew throws a party for his friends. And it sounds like quite a dinner. Imagine disreputable people drinking wine, talking, laughing, maybe even poking fun at Matthew, who just quit his job and walked out the door. And there's Jesus sitting in the middle of it, maybe laughing, maybe poking fun at Matthew too, I don't know. I mean, who doesn't want to hang out in a party like that? Well, it turns out maybe the other disciples were quite uneasy to be there as well. It's not just the Pharisees who might have been taken back a bit by Jesus' choice of companions in Matthew. Keep in mind, those other fishermen disciples would have gladly veered to avoid Matthew's tax toll booth and seen him as a traitor, part of the oppression of Rome, because he was working at a counting desk that had been strategically placed near the route out of Galilee, where the fishermen would transport their catch. And as they brought their fish, it would be Matthew who stopped and said, "Here's what you owe, for me and for the government." He's there to tax the people who were hauling fish. So the tension here is not only with the Pharisees, but also with the disciples themselves. The drift of the overall story suggests that by calling Matthew, Jesus is driving home a point intended not only for outside observers, but also for his own followers. Jesus is turning the tables on even the band of disciples that he is pulling together. Jesus' actions just don't fit with the expectations of the Pharisees or the fishermen. When the disciples are questioned about what Jesus is doing, they have trouble providing an answer. Jesus will speak up for himself because it's puzzling to the disciples. It's not that the disciples are clueless or that the Pharisees are necessarily bad or evil people here in the Gospel of Matthew, but that Matthew Rather, it's raising up the question of why Jesus, someone who is so interested in these holy things and encountering God and knowing God, would be engaging folks who don't fit that same bill. The question raised for the disciples, and which remains for us, is, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? It appears that he's dragging the holiness of God through the mud, and it doesn't sit well. But that is what so much of his ministry is like. And that's not a criticism of Judaism, but it vividly shows the ways in which Jesus is doing exactly what he said he has come to do. Not to call the righteous, but the sinners. So why does he do this? What game is Jesus engaged in all this countercultural activity? Because really, after a while, it's really annoying in any culture when we're doing the things like it's always been done, and then all of a sudden to get someone who's not concerned with the status quo, not concerned with the things that society says that we need to be concerned about, with security and power and the good work that we have to do to earn our place and to take care of our families. And he's genuinely compelling still to all kinds of people. He's compelling to people who are making tons of money with the government and both the folks who the government is oppressing. Those are the people that Jesus is reaching out to, and it seems that out of this group, both have people who say, yes, I want some of that. And it's this mixing up of expectation and confusion that make it appear to many that he's dragging the holiness of God down to the lowest level. He's turning everything upside down. His response to the question of what he is doing comes as, those who are well need no doctor, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I've come not to call the righteous, but the sinners. And what is that point? In a nutshell, what does that mean? That no one is disqualified by becoming part of the movement. And indeed, that Jesus is most interested in people who need help, not just as a righteous religious person, but as a physician who's most interested in the sick. As the Gospel of Matthew has been making clear in its opening chapters up until this point, Jesus is a healer. He comes not to reward those who are already well, but rather to help people become well in the first place. So what happens to us when we follow Jesus? Matthew didn't say, okay, I'm abandoning this oppressive role in all the people that I knew in that life, and I'm walking away completely. Maybe Abraham did that, but Matthew is different. But rather, he says, I'm abandoning this oppressive role, and I'm going to invite the people that are doing that to meet the one that compelled me to leave that role. So that becomes part of the answer as to why Jesus is hanging out with these people. Because Matthew brought them to Jesus, and because those were the people that he hung out with, because those were the people that he loved, and Jesus didn't abandon them either. I wonder what we make of this story. If we were to slow down and imagine it opening up our social expectations of who we might invite to our own dinner parties. Who sits on the other end of our political leanings that we might not imagine in our own homes, that we might disapprove of, and simply prefer to avoid, like the fishermen avoiding the tax collectors? Who is that neighbor who puts out those signs you don't like in their yard? But just imagine this moment when Matthew's response to Jesus' call continues by bringing Jesus to dinner with both the oppressor and the oppressed, the tax collector and the fisherman at the same table. What a vision! A moment of reconciliation, a moment that teaches what grace and faith look like. Faith not only as leaving something behind, but also faith as an extended invitation with the trust that God's healing is for everyone. But this is not the only vision of grace that Matthew's gospel offers to us today. There's also a continuation of stories where more unexpected people show up, and also traditional ways that we are keen to characterize faith might be called into question. For along with Jesus' example, this passage provides us with an unlikely hero and an unforgettable heroine. The synagogue leader who humbles himself and the untouchable woman who has the grit to grab hold of Jesus' cloak. They come from different places and for different but similar reasons. One is at the top of the social ladder, and the other has been left off entirely. One has an urgent and desired need, and the other a chronic and more complicated condition. But both have faith in their desperation. So regardless of their social status or personal circumstance, they receive attention from Jesus and find the healing that they seek as their own faith is recognized and named. As Matthew rearranges these stories, they share a common theme. Jesus' barrier-dissolving, healing, life-giving ministry as an approach to salvation and faith that defies categories, even about where faith itself is found. Jesus comes to save sinners, he says, outsiders, those who do not have it together, those who need help and healing, even tax collectors. So for us today, this means even and especially people you might look down on or distrust or either in any way disrespect. All those that we're counting out, Jesus is inviting them in, and sometimes even following their lead. Faith shows us not only Abraham and Moses dropping everything to follow a call, but also as reaching out in desperate need and hoping and trusting God for a compassionate response. Where is faith found? In walking away and leaving behind? Yes, but also in Matthew's hospitality and the possibility of reconciliation with even enemies, but also in the women's desperate and bold actions, and in the leader's humbling and vulnerable request. Faith is working and healing is found. So as we imagine faith in our own lives, I don't know where it is in your life, but it's awful comforting to know that Jesus not only calls us to follow him, but also promises to follow us and shows us that he follows us into our darkest valleys of desperate need, where God's goodness and mercy not only follow us, but pursue us as well, just like he pursues our enemies. And at the end of the day, I hope that faith is not merely an affirmation of some kind of doctrine or our own merit, but is found both in our following God and God's call, and in our own, my own, desperate moments of need. Amen.